Crawfish Bottom was a neighborhood in North Frankfort, Kentucky. Initially, it was the place where nobody else wanted to live, so it was where the poor people lived because it had the cheapest housing. It was the area of Frankfort that flooded oftentimes, and so that really was attractive to recently freed slaves in the late 1860s, early 1870s. It also was very attractive to the families of prison inmates who were at the penitentiary. Their families would move up and needed cheap housing because their breadwinner basically was incarcerated. And so you had a lot of families of incarcerated prisoners. You had freed slaves, and you actually had a great deal of poor immigrant families. And again, this area of Frankfort was flooded oftentimes, and so the housing was oftentimes considered dilapidated. A lot of people in the early newspapers were calling for the cleanup of this neighborhood in the 1870s and the 1880s, were saying somebody needs to do something about this neighborhood. Really, I'd say it was a pretty wild place between the 1870s and the 1930s. It had a reputation as being the bad part of town, and during that period of time, that reputation was probably well-founded. There was a lot of wild activity. The loggers, there was a couple logging facilities here on the river, and the loggers would float down from eastern Kentucky, and they would get paid for their logs, and they'd go crazy for a weekend. And so a lot of the joints, a lot of the saloons, a lot of the prostitution was actually occurring here in this neighborhood. And so that's what contributed to this reputation that this neighborhood had. Interestingly enough, historians got a hold of that. One of the earliest historical references to the neighborhood is in the 1930s, 1940s, when historians started to refer to it as the seedy underbelly of Frankfort. And so once historians got a hold of it, that version of the neighborhood really became entrenched in public memory. And so despite the fact that the neighborhood really in the 1930s, 40s, 50s really became just a poor, very close-knit neighborhood, it was known still as this really rowdy, wild part of town.
So what was the demographic of Crawfish Bottom again?
It was always known as the black part of town. But that percentage was really, the majority was very slight. Oftentimes it was very much Irish. It was very much sort of immigrant demographic. All of them were poor, but it was a very working class neighborhood. We had police officers who lived in Craw. We had folks who worked in the hemp factory, folks who worked at the local distillery or the shoe factory, who all lived in this neighborhood. So it was very much a working class neighborhood. Interestingly enough, the most recent residents who lived there in the 1950s, who we interviewed for the Oral History Project, remember it as an integrated neighborhood before formal integration. Time after time, people were talking about how they were unified more by class, more by their economic situation, more by the fact that they were poor, than the fact that then they were divided by the fact that they were white and black. And so that was a really interesting perspective that I didn't necessarily expect when the oral history interviews were being done, and it was really neat to hear that.
So ultimately, what happened to Crawfish Bottom?
Crawfish Bottom, like I said, they've been calling for the destruction of the neighborhood since the 1870s. That call was persistent. Greater Frankfort felt like this was the bad part of town. 1913, they did a major study where they documented the slums of Frankfort, and a lot of the pictures in my book are from this photographic documentation of the slums of Frankfort, which are just amazing. But a lot of people were sort of likening slums to disease and during that time period, and so there was a lot of calls for cleaning up the neighborhood. Really the 1950s, when urban renewal really swept the nation, was when Frankfort decided that Crawfish Bottom, at that point it was referred to as the Craw or the Bottoms, was wiped out due to urban renewal. It was replaced with a civic center, a hotel, a YMCA, a state government building, the state tower, and a plaza of shops. You know, so I think the vision was that this would be kind of a mall, a pedestrian mall that people could walk and shop and whatnot. we're actually standing on the corner of the grounds of the old state capitol in Frankfort. And right across the street from the old state capitol was really where Crawfish Bottom began, which was interesting that you had the state legislators right across the street, and from what was considered the bad part of town, it was considered, the neglected part of town, and you were a stone's throw away from where the laws were happening. But it was actually about 50 acres that was taken out by urban renewal. And so there's a lot of question. Even the people who lived there couldn't really give a consistent answer as to exactly what blocks and streets actually made up the neighborhood, which is kind of the fun of it, actually, to hear them talk about these sort of shifting boundaries of this neighborhood. And what did you consider to be Craw? Well, some people said Craw was just the corner of Clinton and Washington streets, whereas some people would actually say, well, that was Craw, but the rest of it was Bottoms. Some people would say the whole thing is Craw. Some people would say that Craw was really these 4 blocks, but beyond that was the Bottoms. So it was really an interesting exercise, I think, in memory, in public perception, public memory of where people lived, their neighborhood. Interestingly enough, it was also something that they were remembering, something that no longer existed. And so these were things that they had. The person who did the interviews would bring a map and show them a map of the neighborhood, and they would look at that map and sort of say, well, this was Craw here and here and here. But it wasn't like these were buildings and streets that they had been walking for the last 20 years. Those were gone.
Where did the families go that were driven out of Craw?
That's a little bit of the controversy, because a great deal of promises were made by the city, promising sort of public housing, affordable housing options. And the city really fell short of its promises in terms of saying that we were going to provide alternative housing. And folks ended up going everywhere, and wherever they could afford to live. And a lot of the feedback that we got in the interviews really was saddened by that fact. It was not so much the loss of the neighborhood as much as it was a loss of the community, where they're saying, I'm the only African American in this neighborhood, and I couldn't tell you who lives next door to me on either side. When in reality, what they were living in when they were here in the neighborhood was really a situation where they could go to their neighbor, they checked on their neighbor. If their neighbor hadn't been seen, that day, someone's going over there and knocking on that door and making sure they're okay. And to sort of contrast that with the putting people into, maybe a nicer, quote unquote, neighborhood, but a neighborhood that had complete lack of community, was really disheartening for most of the residents. And so I think that's where the feelings of frustration, the feelings of resentment about the whole process came about. So the folks who were displaced by urban renewal, for the most part, pretty much resent the whole process and were frustrated by losing that sense of community. Now, had the city, I think, delivered, on the promise of providing the housing that they had once stated that they were going to provide, that might have been a little bit different, but at least according to the residents, those options weren't there for them, and so that's where a lot of the frustration began to unfold.
How did you come across this story?
I was the archivist who had this oral history collection in our collection. I worked at the Kentucky Historical Society as the oral history archivist, and we had a collection of over 8,000 interviews, and one of these collections was just called The Craw, and didn't really know what it was about, and I attended a presentation being given early on by one of my supervisors, Jim Wallace, and he had done these interviews back in 1991 as part of his work on his master's degree at the University of Kentucky. And he had done these interviews and he had written some papers, and he was giving these old slideshow, I say old slideshow, sorry Jim, these slideshow presentations to Rotary groups, to Kiwanis clubs, to historic Frankfort Inc. had a presentation, I remember. And he was just on the road, and he's given this sort of drumbeat of, people knew this as the bad part of town, but it really was the good part of town, and this is why. In some ways, again, swinging too far in the other direction at times, saying that, you know, they never lock their doors and I don't know what these people are talking about. And I think what happens is, that's where I became really interested in, is seeing the two sides of history being sort of batted about, and curious as to not just the story of the neighborhood, but looking at how the process of creating history actually happens. And so that's when I sort of gravitated to the collection and thought, well, you know, this is a story that needs to be told.